Hello and welcome to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena. And today we've got a really special episode because we are going to be talking about a monumental shift in cybersecurity for financial institutions. And that's because of the Tiber EU framework. So joining me, we have Howard Shortt from AIB and Anthony Long from Nettitude. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here today. Could I actually get you guys to introduce yourselves? So Anthony, could you tell me and our viewers a bit more about your role at Nettitude and Nettitude itself, please?
Sure, I'm pleased to be here, thank you. Hi, I'm Anthony Long, Managing Principal Security Consultant at Nettitude. Nettitude is a provider of cybersecurity services, bringing thought leadership to the ever-evolving cybersecurity marketplace. Through our research and innovation centres, Nettitude provides threat-led services that span technical assurance, consulting and managed detection and response offerings, operating at the forefront of the industry. My role is Head of Threat Intelligence and Advisory Consulting, which entails delivering cybersecurity propositions which stay abreast of evolving legislation and regulatory cybersecurity landscapes, helping our clients prioritise their cybersecurity risks and enabling them to focus on the activities that are the core of their business.
Absolutely, excellent, and thank you very much. And so, Howard, could you also give us a bit of an introduction to your role at AIB, please?
Sure, thanks, Doug. So Howard Shortt, and working at AIB in cyber threat management with specific responsibility for threat and vulnerability management. So that encompasses a number of core services. So you've got the threat and vulnerability discovery, you've also got compliance management, and then security testing, which involves all of the pen testing scenarios that we're going to talk about.
Excellent. Well, I think the best place to start is actually, if we can give our viewers who might not be aware currently, a bit of an overview to the Tiber EU framework. So Anthony, could you give us that brief overview, please?
Sure. So firstly, Tiber stands for Threat Intelligence-Based Ethical Red Teaming. Tiber EU was jointly developed by the European Central Bank and the EU National Central Banks and launched in May 2018. To deliver bespoke, controlled, intelligence-led red team testing of an entities or the organisations going through the test critical live production systems. It differs from traditional penetration testing with a much wider scope, where not only are systems tested, but also the people, processes and procedures that underpin them. A Tiber test simulates potential attacks by real, highly advanced threat groups and or actors to test whether the defensive measures taken by the organisation going through the test are actually effective in defending against those. The Tiber EU framework sets out a three-phase process for the end-to-end Tiber test, these being firstly the preparation phase, which includes engagement, scoping, procurement, and the creation of the teams responsible for managing the test. The second phase is the testing phase. This is made up of threat intelligence and red teaming activities. In this phase, the threat intelligence provider prepares a targeted threat intelligence report on the entity, setting out the attack scenarios for the test and useful information on the organisation. This reporting is then used by the red team to develop its attack approach and to target and attempt to try and breach specified critical live production systems, people and processes that underpin the organisation's critical functions. The final phase is the closure phase. This includes remediation, planning and result sharing. Here, the red team produce reporting, which includes details of the approach taken to the testing and the findings and observations from the test. Reporting will also include advice on areas of improvement in terms of technical controls, policies and procedures and education awareness. To finish the Tiber process, the tested organisation develops its and agrees its own remediation plan in close consultation with its supervisor and or regulator.
Brilliant. So I can imagine what we're going to be pulling in some of the stuff you've talked about there, particularly the educational side of things. So I think before we go any further though, when we look to the future, I think it's going to be good to be able to look back and see what the core objectives of the framework were. So Howard, could you give me a brief introduction in terms of what will the objectives be, and as a result we'll be able to see if they are successful in the future?
Sure, absolutely, Doug. But and also too, just let me expand a moment on Anthony's points. We got to look at why this regulation and directive, has been introduced. It's a framework. The framework itself has been introduced. You got to look back at the attack in India against the Bank of Bangladesh, which attempted to exfiltrate €81 million. So that was a rather large attack type that was conducted against the SWIFT infrastructure. So as a means to try and stop that from happening, the bank, organization and regulatory bodies needed to understand how resilient they would be to these kind of attacks. So what Tiber sets out as its core objective is to mimic the real world threat scenarios and to measure an organization's resilience to those scenarios, as well as to improve their defense capabilities. So it's an acknowledgement that threats and attacks cannot be prevented. They are going to happen. So it's around making sure that the standards, the tactics, the procedures are all in place to prevent the impact from being too severe.
It's interesting to hear that finally, I think it's such a core and key thing to finally have organizations realize that attacks are going to happen. You can't create this system which is completely impenetrable and we're just in a fairyland almost. So yeah, it's absolutely brilliant to hear this change of almost regulatory and framework culture. So I guess, Anthony, could I come to you and ask, really, is this framework comprehensive enough? Is it just a cultural shift? Do you think this is an example of banks finally getting on the same level of cybersecurity maturity that maybe tech companies had previously?
So I think, in short, it's yes is the answer. What needs to be remembered is that the finance sector relies on trust and credibility, and the very real threat of cyber attacks threaten that premise daily, as just explained. Financial institutions have always been an attractive target for attackers, given the access to financial assets as well as highly sensitive information. And in addition, the attack surface for these organizations is continuously growing due to the increasing demand for online services, mobile applications, as well as shift towards remote working, given the current, situation we're in, obviously with COVID. There was an overnight shift to remote working, which has introduced its own complexities and challenges, but that has increased the attack surface. Organizations need to have an acceptance that complete security is unobtainable, just as Howard was just explaining. They need to think about and implement resilience capabilities that will respond in the face of attacks. This means that traditional cybersecurity needs to move away from controls which only focus on resistance, but development and deployment of capabilities that will limit an impact and extent of those attacks, with the organisation still being able to continue to function at an agreed level during an event and then being able to recover. This is where Tiber tests come into their own, or tests of that nature, but on a global footing. To address exactly to test, an organisation's critical live production services based on real life and current attack scenarios pertaining specifically to the tested organisation. This level of testing is conducted on live production environments. It is full scope, it's multi-layered, it's attack simulation designed to measure how well an organization's people, processes and technologies and physical security controls for that matter can withstand an attack from a real life adversary. This is something that traditional penetration testing is not designed to do.
Yeah, I can imagine. And Howard, could I actually get your input on this as well? Do you see it as quite a comprehensive framework? Has this been a necessary framework that should have been coming in almost before this, effectively?
There is an expectation within financial services that defense is strong, but traditionally that relies on perimeter defense. And over time, we've seen the complete dissolution of perimeters in favor of mobile devices. So your perimeter is now everywhere where you have an employee. And as such, protecting that perimeter becomes much, much harder. So by having tests that mimic real world attack techniques against your critical systems, it just simply demonstrates where potential weaknesses may exist that you can improve upon. And that's the idea, I think, behind Tiber. And the EU framework, while that has been in place since 2018, the Irish framework, so Tiber-IE, has been in place since last December. And that particular flavour, it just, again, slants it more towards an Irish financial services industry and sets out the body of work that has to be conducted. And you're involving the multiple teams through all of your attack cycles. So you've got your red team testers, which are typically hired from external to the organization to remain a level of independence. Then you've got your blue teams, who are all of your responders on the inside of the network who can help to defend your scenarios. You've got the white team, which are all of the people in the know. Tiber testing, by its very nature, you could set off an alarm to the blue team and they could be on alert for those kind of attacks. We don't want that to happen as part of this. They need to be surprised by what occurs, and they need to take appropriate, effective actions. And then amongst those then as well, you've got the Tiber test team for cyber oversight, which exists within Ireland at the CBI level. And all of those teams working together can help to conduct a real world test.
Exciting. Well, Howard, if I could just stick with you for a minute then, if we kind of look to the future almost with this, as you said, the original framework in 2018, the Irish one at the end of last year, do you think this is going to enable banks to succeed in the digital world far better than they would have done before? We've talked about the fact that you now have your employees being the first line of defense and they're working from home. I hate to use the phrase, in this new normal, is this going to help them?
There's an element of this where participation, while it's voluntary at the moment, all right, so the framework itself and the participation within the framework is voluntary, but there is an expectation that it's going to become mandatory. So when you then look at what banks need to do in order to conduct mandatory testing and the regulatory burden that exists already, and how they might then succeed or better enable their own products and bring to market new technologies, the last thing any bank wants to be is front and center in the papers as a result of a breach. So by protecting their market share and by conducting these tests, they can better enable themselves to produce market-leading applications that are secure.
Excellent. And Anthony, as well, could I get your input on this as well? Looking to the future, what is this framework really going to help banks deal with in this new digital environment that we're in?
Yeah, so I was just going to, Howard hit the nail on the head there. The ever-increasing prevalence of digitally enabled organisation means that rarely a day goes without, the news or the headline saying security appearing in that headline from around the world. Tiber is increasingly being used by supervisors to enhance, the resilience of financial services and other financial market infrastructures in Europe, and also it is gaining traction. You only need to look at the recent regulatory trends and publications to see, these tests are increasing in popularity and frequency, maybe even moving to that annual footing, which Howard just explained to there. And I suppose that will be driven by the size of the organisation and their criticality, and obviously what economic functions they obviously provide into the finance sector that obviously they play in, so to speak. And I suppose the other angle to throw in there is that this also brings boards into the mix as well. So typical testing generally only lands in the technical arena in security functions, but Tiber and other regulatory driven frameworks obviously put it on the board radar. And those boards need to oversee such exercises as Tiber, be it on a regular basis or a longer footing, longer duration. But they also need to use it to be able so they can demonstrate the use of it and how they use the lessons learned from those exercises, so that they can ensure that their organisation has operational resilience strategies that actually are fit for purpose, allowing them to have a security posture that's commensurate to the threat profile.
Interesting. So now that we're bringing in the boards and this regulatory oversight and this executive oversight, Howard, when we think of banks, we've already spoken in this panel how the banks are used to that. So they have that trust level. That's what's key to a bank's kind of effective selling point. So would it be fair to say that financial institutions are actually already used to this level of regulatory framework? Or is this actually going to be something really revolutionary, quite scary, and ultimately a good place to jump off of going into the future?
Okay, so just a couple of questions wrapped up in that.
Yeah, sorry, it was almost loaded there. But yeah, so to cut it down then, I guess, would it be fair to say that banks are used to this level of framework and regulatory oversight?
Yes, absolutely. You can't operate as a bank within this country, or in fact any country within the EU in particular, without some form of regulatory oversight. It is necessary, and it's a necessary component to protect not just the bank, but also the customers and the investors within that bank. So it's necessary to be there. This framework is new. okay, and it's on a maturity setting that will evolve over time. That's natural and it's expected. But the ability to withstand the attacks are an important demonstration because it gives a level of assurance to executive and board level, as well as regulatory oversight, that you know what, we are going to suffer attacks, but we will be okay if the attacks are formed in this particular scenario or in that particular scenario. You're never going to cover everything, but that's why it's necessary to have Tiber, which uses real threat intelligence to produce the kind of red teaming effect on a bank that would set off the alarm bells and require the appropriate level of response. So, as I mentioned, Doug, the framework itself is currently voluntary. But if you're voluntary in that and you're not conducting your tests, well, you know what happens? Very quickly after that, it becomes mandatory. And so, as Anthony laid out as well, look, you're not going to get away from this. It's important to get on top of it, get out ahead of it, start conducting your research, start conducting the kind of approaches and resilience measures that are necessary to be able to withstand these kind of attacks. And you know what? You can get these tests done in advance of participation without the need to report to your regulatory body. You go out to your certified testers and you can conduct a statement of work and you have them come on board and test your asset.
Interesting. So, I mean, Anthony, would you agree with Howard there that this is something that we can jump ahead of and attempt to really start getting ahead of, and is this going to be a kind of mandatory thing that banks are going to have to do? And also, with large institutions like a bank, is it possible to really actually start preparing for this before it's effectively necessary?
I was going to say, I totally agree with Howard. Proactive is key. I suppose what these tests actually do as well is show you the level of testing that is not only expected, but the good work that you should do on your own proactive basis. How you build this level of testing into your own security programs from an internal basis. So you're not waiting for your regulator to come knocking on the door saying, this is a very good test, it's a very good scheme, why you're not doing it. I suppose the only thing to add there is, as I was saying, regulation is not new for financial organisations in any way, shape or form. I suppose what Tiber and other testing frameworks are doing is probably changing the level of interaction that they're having with their regulators for different size organisations. And in some cases, that interaction could be completely new for a lot of institutions. So that's a good thing in my view, because it allows them to have a good, open and meaningful conversation with the regulator, seeking clarity around those expectations. I suppose the regulatory statutory objectives are the drivers for any framework changes, while these frameworks are being designed and rolled out, in the first place, where they expect a safe and secure financial system is maintained. But they also know that resilience is impacted by people, processes, and not just technology again. Therefore, getting the basics right is essential, which is what Howard was speaking to there. Operational resilience is very clearly at the top of the regulatory agenda, and financial organisations are acknowledging that and addressing the fact that the regulators now, I would say, are becoming less tolerant with organisations that are not meeting those expectations, and as a result falling behind in developing their resilience capabilities, hence the various testing frameworks. So I suppose in some cases you could argue these frameworks could be seen as regulatory intervention, but I would say they're not. It's just showing you the good work that can be done and should be undertaken, be it from an active and proactive basis. And I would say organisations are well placed, and frameworks like Tiber allow them to prepare for and demonstrate resilience to a much greater range of operational scenarios, which is what yourself and Howard are speaking to there. This is including issues arising from third parties, obviously utilised by organisations where they outsource systems out of processes to. And I would just like to say the last thing there, testing like Tiber also allows organisations to continue their journey in developing capabilities which respond to the ever-evolving threat landscape. This is all key because it provides assurance specifically and critically if the regulator comes knocking on the door, the organisation is able to demonstrate the good work that they are doing to maintain that security posture.
Excellent. And Howard, with that in mind, it's come to my attention through this conversation that there is a kind of educational side of things, because much in the same way as fraud, you're as weak as your human elements effectively. It's not just a technological aspect. So, I mean, what can an institution do, and what does the framework imply they have to do when it comes to improving employees' education of this system?
Oh, look, awareness is key. I mean, that has to be the primary and foundation principle that we as security professionals will work from. Making sure that people are aware of the kind of activities that can land them in trouble by clicking on malicious links, phishing exercises, social engineering, all of those kind of activities. But in Tiber specifically, it's like all standard bets are off. They're going to come at you any way they can to achieve their objective, which is to demonstrate exploit. And while a bank or any other institution may take steps to discover vulnerabilities, to maintain a reasonable compliance posture, it's done on a siloed basis. So you have your vulnerabilities and they're rated in their criticality, and you have your non-compliance and maybe it's rated in the criticality. What Tiber testing does is it combines all of those into a single attack method or an attack chain with the sole intention of disrupting your business. So being able to withstand the kind of impact that can have brings around a level of awareness and education anyway. But in addition, it just helps everybody within the security industry to grow their skill sets, their capabilities, and it's a very hot market. I mean, look at a quick peruse on LinkedIn will demonstrate those who have CREST-enabled testing or CREST-certified testing capabilities. You got to look at all of the different organizations providing the kind of certificates that are necessary for ethical testers to conduct their practices. But Tiber is very specific. So you've got at the moment a very short list of people that you can call upon, and that will grow. It'll give credence to the market to demonstrate the need for ethical security testing, continued security testing on critical infrastructures. So moving beyond the banks and beyond that kind of industry itself, you're working then into national critical infrastructure as well, but then you're into regulation.
Oh, wow. Absolutely brilliant. And to kind of following on from that move to national and then expanding the industry as well to realizing this type of testing is needed. Since it's a joint nature framework and it's going to impact all member states, obviously in different flavors, as Howard you brought up. And does that mean that the bad guys in this situation are actually going to have an incredibly hard time in Europe in particular?
I'd like to say yes, but it's not the silver bullet. I would say testing. We cannot be complacent. A threat actor with the right level of motivation and tools will have success. They're always one step ahead of us. We're only as informed as the last known test. It's about how the member states and sectors move as a herd and collectively harden. I would say, therefore making it harder for cyber threat actors to have success. Not to mention, it deters them as they need to work harder. At the end of the day, a threat actor maybe want to achieve an objective, but they want to try and achieve it with less effort. They don't want to work hard. So if we can make ourselves a harder target or the sector a harder target, hopefully they will look elsewhere. That's not necessarily good for where else they look, but obviously for us, it's making ourselves harder. We're always, as I say, be one step behind the cyber threats. These are evolving at an unprecedented rate, which is why testing of an organization's ability to prevent, detect, and respond to an attack is vital. These threat actors are constantly advancing their tools, techniques, and procedures to remain ahead of our security protection. That's why preparation is essential in cybersecurity, as it is in any walk of life. To effectively defend against the latest threats, a proactive approach is required. Tiber tests do that. And the likes, and they should not be one-offs. They should be routine. So it's not about, obviously saying before, about the regulator knocking on your door to say, are you going to do a Tiber test now? Or here's a good scheme, you should use it. It's about adopting it, embracing it, and using it as a culture change in the organization to obviously gain insights into how your vulnerabilities present and how your capabilities and resilience capabilities respond should those vulnerabilities be exploited. This is about fundamental security practices, getting the basics right. And obviously testing like this, I think it's key to remember, it doesn't replace traditional testing such as vulnerability scanning and traditional penetration testing. It complements it. It's that next level, it's the next rung on the ladder to gain insight so you understand how your capabilities respond as in a business as usual response, the ground truth. And I'd just like to say probably the last part is where we've seen organizations or our clients adopting Tiber and obviously going through those tests, it allows them to check for those weaknesses and security holes in critical systems that typical testing just doesn't even look out or discover. And what this allows them to do at the end of that is understand how they present, where these vulnerabilities emanate from, so you're undertaking root cause analysis, and that ultimately helps them and effectively allows them to increase their resilience to cyber attacks. You're plugging the holes, but at the same time developing your resilience capabilities specifically around detection and response.
Excellent, guys. And I've got to say, one thing that's really come across from this talk is just how incredible this framework really does seem to be setting the industry standard. But I want to kind of take it back and focus on ourselves a bit slightly here. So Howard, could I ask, you mentioned briefly, obviously, the ECB, the European Central Bank, brought this in, and then obviously the ICB brought in the kind of Irish flavour of it. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and how the different kind of regional flavours work into a larger scheme of things, and what AIB have been looking at with this framework?
Well, again, just kind of like a multi-pronged answer that I have to give you here, because every country, when a directive or regulation occurs, so directive is the approach to implementing something across the European Union. So all member states will be looking at this framework and they will be adopting their localized version of it. And the reason it's being done across the entire sector, across the entire union, is the majority of financial services and institutions operate in more than one member state. So by having a common framework for testing critical infrastructures that delivers something that is easily translated into a common standard, makes reporting to your regulator a lot easier. So it's a way of actually harmonizing the kind of testing that gets done. And just ultimately, that gives us that level of cooperation and next generation sharing of intelligence information across platforms and across the industry.
Excellent. And conversely, also, Anthony, can I get your input into what Nettitude does specifically when it comes to Tiber EU framework, please?
So obviously, we're a provider for the threat intelligence and obviously the penetration red teaming elements of a Tiber engagement. We're accredited by CREST, which is obviously some of the requirements to evidence how capable we are and how we can deliver an end-to-end engagement which is fully risk assessed and managed, which is absolutely key, but specifically when you're testing on live production environments, which is what Tiber requires. I would say, Tiber is a very time-consuming process. We cannot lie about that, and it requires a large amounts of preparation and planning, even if you're well versed in security best practices. Tiber is a journey, and I would like to say Nettitude we're fully experienced and seasoned to guide you on that sort of cyber security journey, specifically catering for the scale and complexity of a multi-stakeholder testing engagement. Back to Howard's point there, it can span multi-jurisdictions and domiciles, and obviously having those stakeholders aligned is absolutely key and critical to the success of that test. And ultimately, so when we're guiding you on that journey, the results are accepted on a cross-border level as well. So they're accepted through multiple jurisdictions across multiple regulators. I suppose the other part is a key differentiator for us as in Nettitude is not only our dedicated research and innovation team, who, as I say from the opening part, are at the forefront of industry, creating the new tools and techniques that we utilize in testing that allows us to simulate these real-world threats, but also the consultants who have been seasoned in this testing, as I say. So they have experience going through the Tiber test, not only as a consultant, but having been in some of the banks or financial institutions in the first place. So they understand both sides of the fence, which I think is key to helping deliver a successful test. And I'd just like to say the last part is, we provide the insight and unparalleled levels of value to all those stakeholders. So it's not just about delivering a successful test, finding all the holes, finding the gaps, or the things that are not working. It's about understanding why are those vulnerabilities there in the first place. So helping the client understand the processes and actions that need to be undertaken post-testing, the root cause analysis, helping design and implement that remediation plan, which is probably the most critical part to any type of test. Is what do you do with those results? How do you remediate them? Ultimately answering the question, how vulnerable are you, or are we, and where do we need to be? So what does that journey look like?
Interesting. Well, guys, thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for today. It's been absolutely apparent to me just how all-encompassing this framework is, and it's exciting to see that. I think for me the most exciting thing is seeing that cultural shift to realize there will always be attacks. It's just how you deal with them, and you've got to be cleverer than that. So thank you both for your input, and to all our viewers, thank you very much for watching. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at www.fintechf.com, and of course YouTube and LinkedIn, where I'll see you there. So thank you very much, and goodbye.